author that is having incredible success in this country as well. We just found out that they published only here 400,000 of her books, so it was a very exciting evening. And right now we're doing something that has very little to do with Italy, but has a lot to do with the fact that Casa Italiana is not only an Italian institution, and we believe that any form of culture, literature, art has the right to be presented here. And we're delighted that we are celebrating tonight a great cultural figure from the Martinique, Édouard Glissant. And to do this, we have the fortune of having Christopher Winks, that is one of the foremost scholars of African American Caribbean literature, a translator, among others, of Jorge Luis Borges and also of Édouard Glissant. And he's going to be chairing this panel, and I leave to him the honor to introduce his guests for the panel. Please welcome them all with an applause.
I begin with a journey into opacity for those of you who don't speak French. These are the first two stanzas from Édouard Glissant's Afrique, in honor of Penn World Voices' concentration and focus on Africa. Oh oh, voici au dénué, tu éclabousses. À la fin, je connais l'enfant las qui en toi gémit. J'ai reconnu l'homme qui va te pourvoyant en mer. À ses côtés drapés de mer, avance l'Africaine, qui ose la nommer, elle répond, il voit sa reine. Oh oh, servante ainsi longtemps, tu fus d'exil, et désir magnifique, mais désir, absence et vœu. Comme d'un rêve fut la reine hormis la royauté, or l'homme endormi pleure, à ses pieds le soleil du soir, tisse la mort et l'arbre nu, sans fruit ni reposoir. I forego translation in honor of opacity, which Glissant said we all have the right to. Before I continue, may I advise you and remind you to turn off any and all devices other than rhetorical ones, which you may need for the Q&A after the panel. Édouard Glissant joined the Ancestors a little over 4 years ago in February of 2011 at the age of 82, leaving behind a vast, challenging, multifarious, and multifaceted legacy spanning well over half a century of activity. No single panel can possibly encompass the totality. Glissant himself remarked, "Le lieu est incontournable, the place cannot be circumscribed." However, our distinguished panelists will surely illuminate and, I trust, debate some of its facets. After I introduce our panelists, I will say a few very brief words about Glissant and his work by way of setting the scene in context. Then I will ask the panelists a general question about their response to Glissant's ideas, and they'll discuss that among themselves, and possibly in a gesture towards the inattendu, the unexpected, present them with a few of Glissant's more provocatively aphoristic statements, which they can develop or contest as the spirit moves them. After all, as Glissant himself remarked, the magnet of the world leads us in those directions we did not know. Ideally, I'd like to leave about half an hour for the public to ask questions of the panelists, because this event is first and foremost about relation, of which Glissant famously observed in Poetics of Relation, "We know ourselves as part and as crowd in an unknown that does not terrify. We cry our cry of poetry. Our boats are open and we sail them for everyone." So, from the furthest to my left, Kaiama Glover is Associate Professor of French and Africana Studies at Barnard College, Columbia University. She is the author of Haiti Unbound, a spiralist challenge to the post-colonial canon. Spiral is also an image dear to Glissant. She is the co-editor of Revisiting Marie-Vieux Chauvet, Paradoxes of the Post-Colonial Feminine, forthcoming as a special issue of Yale French Studies, and of The Haiti Exception, Anthropology and the Predicaments of Narrative, forthcoming from Liverpool University Press. Glover is also the translator of Franck Etienne's Ready to Burst and of Marie-Vieux Chauvet's Dance on the Volcano. Achille Mbembe is research professor in history and politics at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa, and visiting professor in the Department of Romance Studies, Duke University. He is also a convener of the Johannesburg Workshop in Theory and Criticism and author and editor of the Johannesburg Salon, an online cultural magazine. He is the author of numerous books in French and has published extensively in some of the major journals in France. His work has been translated in English, Italian, German, Portuguese, and Spanish. I'll specifically mention here On the Post-Colony, which is a very provocative book and everybody should read. His latest book is Critique de la Raison Nègre. And to my immediate left, Véronique Tadjo is a writer, academic, artist, and scholar. Born in Paris, she grew up in Abidjan, where she did most of her studies. She holds a doctorate in African American studies from the Sorbonne and was a Fulbright scholar at Howard University. Some of her titles in English translation include The Shadow of Imana, Travels in the Heart of Rwanda, Queen Paku, and Far From My Father. Her books for young people have been translated into many languages. She has won several literary awards and is currently, though apparently as of a few days ago no longer, professor of French at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. So I'm going to say a few words about Édouard Glissant, and then I'm going to bow out because you really want to hear from our panelists and not me, but I think it's necessary to say a few words about Glissant for those of you who may be relative newcomers to his work. He was a thinker with a vast literary culture and a doctorate in philosophy from the Sorbonne. He also studied ethnography at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. In his youth, he was a political activist for Antillean autonomy against a neo-colonial departmentalization. He was a founder of projects like the journal Acoma and the Institut du Tout Monde in Paris, and a professor at Louisiana State University and the City University of New York, among others. But most of all, he was a poet, composing what he would call, quote, a poetry in expanse, poésie en étendue. And in that sense, he is a model for all of us who, even if we hesitate to call ourselves poets, nonetheless wish to remain open in our writings, thoughts, and dreams to, quote, that poem not universal but valid for everyone and everywhere, unquote, that subtends, quote, the uncompromising beauty of the world, unquote. Were the first philosophers not themselves poets? And Glissant, working as he was for much of his life in the formidable presence of his illustrious elder Aimé Césaire, took the pirogue of that great singer of negritude's volcanic eruptions in other directions and towards different shores, drawing on the examples of Saint-Jean-Perse and René Char, among others. The surging counterstatement to Saint-Jean-Perse's Anabase, that is Les Indes, the taut poetic Minkisi, charged verbal power amulets of Boise. And unlike Césaire, Glissant ventured frequently into the genre of the novel, notably in a sequence inspired by William Faulkner's saga of Yoknapatawpha County, illustrating the complex intertwinings and entanglements of several Martinican bloodlines, dramatizing the impossibility of a, quote, single root, unquote, origin, and the inextricable creolizations to which Caribbean peoples are heir. And of course, there are his extensive writings on aesthetics, philosophy, poetics, and politics, only a few of which have so far been translated into English. Now that his work has entered fully into that archipelagic tout monde, or all world, whose diversity and ever-multiplying differences, even the smallest of which he affirmed to be precious, we shall never be able to absorb it in its totality. And he would have been glad of that. At the beginning of one of his classes, he told his students, less certainly as a warning than as a tranquil affirmation, vous ne me comprendrez jamais. You will never understand me. And I think we have to look at comprendre in the sense of to grasp in the authoritarian manner. When you think you've got him, he's somewhere else. His oeuvre is rather a trace we must follow to a new region of the world, permanently menaced by the forces of the one that seeks to suppress the other, and yet everywhere around us, ready at every step to be inspired by the uncertain. So now I'd like to ask our panelists, what do you find most enduring and enduringly relevant about Glissant's work, and in what ways has it inflected your own thought and writing? I think we'll go to my immediate left and go from there.
Okay. Well, hello to everybody, and very, very happy to be here. And thank you very much for this introduction. Um, Glissant, I must say I met him in Martinique and towards the end of his life. And I was immediately struck by his presence. Really, somebody you could not ignore. He had this yes massive presence, and his voice really struck me. And I think that I immediately was biased, even though I read his work before knowing him physically. It just strengthened my interest in what he did. Slavery. I think for me, what his whole work on slavery had resonance in me, because when I was a student, when I was much younger, living in Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan, I decided to concentrate on Black American literature and civilization, and I was very interested in the slave trade. And so my PhD thesis was on the process of acculturation of the Black Americans through slavery. So, of course, when I encountered Glissant's work, it really talked to me. And I like this idea of the abyss. This idea that the ship, the slave ship, was an abyss, and that the sea was an abyss. I think it really talked to me also as a poet immediately, and in some of my work later on, and in particular Queen Poku, there's a chapter on this voyage to the unknown, and I think there's a lot of work still to do on this subject, because I think that the relationship between Africa and the Caribbeans, and Africa and the Americas, has not yet been done. I mean, there's a lot of things that are untold. There's a big silence that we need to. It's like an abscess that we need to lens, so that we can talk to each other. Because in the book I just mentioned, Queen Poku, what interested me in the slave trade was the fact that it was the big betrayal. The betrayal of, yes, Africa letting, in a sense, go of its sons and daughters, and to another world, because there had to be some complicity. And I know I'm being controversial here, but for me it was a big betrayal, and we need to come to terms with it, and we have a lot of work to do. So this is something that I want to continue prodding, but there are also other aspects of Glissant's work that I can come back to later on.
Okay.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, you don't have to fight.
Certainly not. I mean, we owe Glissant so much. I'm not sure that we'll ever be able to, if you allow me to speak in those terms, reimburse the debt we owe to Glissant, and through Glissant to the, let's just limit ourselves to this, to the French Caribbean. Of course, Césaire, of course, Fanon, of course, Maryse Condé, and many others. Glissant in particular left us with a heritage of concepts, which I think we have hardly started to, first of all, excavate, and second, repurpose, if you want, insofar as they really help us to make sense of the world we live in, and most importantly, the world that is coming. Just think of his idea of le tout monde, the translation of which, frankly, I have no idea how he translated in English.
I translate it myself as literally as the all world. Because
Okay.
when you say the whole world, then it's like this is the biggest building in the whole world, you know, or the world whole. That's like, you know.
Yeah.
So I say all world, the tout monde.
So le tout monde as, in fact, the only world that we have, the only world that we share, and the only world that we inherit. Think of concepts such as relation, poetics of relation, his amazing critique of the concept of territory as opposed to that of the land, his idea that identity is about movement and not fixity, and something I have been paying attention of late, which escaped me in earlier readings of Glissant, something he calls the love of our earth, which is an introduction to a part of his thinking he didn't have the time to develop at length, his reflection on the politics of ecology. The politics of ecology from the point of view of those whose experience has been about devastation. People in the slums, people in places stricken by drought, and so forth and so on. So we could go on and on. We'll not have enough time to elicit what we owe to him. But there is one thing that I find extremely striking, which I have been trying to elicit for myself. It's Véronique said that when you met him, one thing that was amazing was his physical strength, presence, which, by the way, reminds me of that of Cheikh Anta Diop. Cheikh Anta Diop was like that. I mean, a pharaonic presence, but also his voice. Glissant has makes a very interesting distinction between voice, what he calls a displaced voice, and parole, especially what he calls la parole muette. A displaced voice, he says, is a voice that is more than others exposed to the risk of turning into a parole muette. One that, although uttered, is not heard. So how is it that one manages to emit a voice that is heard? Is part of, it seems to me, the Glissant project. I hope that we can talk about it at some point.
So, when Christopher asked us to think about something that would continue to be relevant and resonant about Glissant's work, I thought that was first a great question and then a really horrible question because I found it entirely overwhelming, and came to realize the extent to which Glissant is like part of the language I use as a scholar, part of the language I use in conversation with other scholars, and absolutely part of the language that I use with my students. And so I thought, all right, what can I offer? And having this conversation or starting this conversation, it was first that, how Glissant has become pedagogically foundational to me. And I'm sure you're going to come to this aphorism, right? La vision prophétique du passé, right? The prophetic vision of the past. Any of my students will tell you that's where I begin almost every class, that I teach on Francophone literature, on post-colonial literature, the subjectivity of the story, the power of storytelling, the extent to which when they come to my class, they come oftentimes in, coming out of the space of the elite US American university, they come with a certain violence of omission having been done to them, right? So I work with French majors who are in upper level seminars with me, who come to my classes on post-colonial or Francophone literature as an elective, and have said to me that this is perhaps the first time that they ever encounter texts written in French by non-Europeans. And it takes us all a bit of time to sort of process that sort of context of violence in which stories are told from only one perspective in only one way. So we begin with Glissant as our point of departure for contestation, for marronnage, to use a word that I'm sure he would prefer we use. And also, though, and this is what I love about both Nous réclamons le droit à l'opacité et une vision prophétique du passé, is that there's not only resistance, contention, marronnage in there, but there's also optimism and ouverture and imagination. And I feel like that capaciousness is very much embedded in Glissant's work. The fact that we're talking about him here right now in the way that we are, the fact that we can just plug his name into Google and literally 1,000 different scholarly articles will come up about him, but that we can still find new ways in every time we approach his work, says something about the foundational nature of the concepts and the terms that he's put out there, how in some way they do resonate, again, in foundational ways. So yeah, that's something that, especially if there are students in the audience, but as we are all professors as well, thinking about both what is opaque about him and therefore very difficult, in fact, to teach. It's hard to teach Glissant, I find, but also how he is this window or this door open to Césaire, to Fanon, to Condé, and obviously far beyond the French-speaking Caribbean. So his sort of conduit role, even in his opacity. There's one of my students, she knows, I quote Glissant like up and down and in between. Right, so his conduit role over the past several decades and into the present moment, and certainly into the future. That is the sort of the politics and the provocation of prophecy that's in his work.
So, would any of you like to comment on what any of the others have said, or comment or expand, I guess would be the way, because you each brought up, again, we're all the blind people and the elephant here, we're talking about massive presence, even after he's gone, and so it would be good to, each one of us brought up something, and it would be good to put that into relation, so to speak, and, see what each of you says to the other.
Yes, what I can say is, because we were talking about voice and everything, I can say that his relation to language, I thought, was absolutely fascinating. He's got such a dense, at least in French, a dense language, a way of using vocabulary and words that have enormous depth. And I do like that when I read even his essays. But I also like the fact, I know that you're saying, and this is true, he's a thinker, but I would say he's a dreamer. He was a dreamer in the sense that he was dreaming of another world, of another way of living, of a third I think he said a third society, and I really like that, although I know that it didn't materialize, and that times have shown that we are facing even harder challenges, and that this idea of people getting together and borders disappearing is not at all what is happening. So in that sense, for me, he was an utopist. He was a dreamer. But we need people like that. And so what we have to do is to start from, continue his work, read it again, try and understand what we did not understand, and then try and find our own solutions as we go, because it's a very, very fast world. And I don't think any one person can understand and encompass all the complexity. But that I'm very, very grateful for in that sense.
Would anybody like to comment on the utopian?
Maybe on the language stuff.
Yeah.
Just to say one or two words about what Véronique just told us about the use of language in Glissant. And for that matter, I mean, once again, in Césaire, in Fanon, Senghor, and all of these. One thing strikes me. Glissant has a relationship to language, and in this case to French, and subsidiarily Creole, that is somewhat different from Fanon. I mean, Fanon gives us a warning in the very first chapter of Peau Noire, Black Skin, White Mask. First chapter on le noir et le langage, I think. He asks us to be very cautious with the language of the colonizer. For one reason, the reason is that if we approach the language of the colonizer in a manner that is not cautious enough, it might induce us into some pathological relationship with that language. Glissant has an entirely different approach to French. He doesn't believe in the purity of language. In fact, he believes that each language lies somewhere about its essence. It lies in the sense that it wants to make us believe that it is pure. And in fact, it's not pure. And what Glissant and the others are really trying to do is, the French word is salir. Ils essaient de salir la langue. The project is to dirty the language. Why is it to dirty the language? To dirty the language because they have to, and here I don't know what the term in English is, they have to speak from that part of human existence that has been reduced to waste. So the project is to turn waste into something he calls le limon. What is the translation of limon? Yeah, le limon. Yes. And this he makes very, very clear in one of the last short pieces he wrote, L'intraitable traité sur la beauté du monde, where the trope of the limon is pushed to its most dramatic consequences. So it seems to me that his politics of language has to do with this, how to turn waste into that which becomes the starting point for a resurrection of not only humans, but of the entire world and the biosphere.
I think I would just, it's interesting the term salir, to dirty the language. To soil the language. I think I would simply add, it's undeniable also. If there is a moment in, I know you've described him as a poet, I think of him not only as a poet but also as a novelist, very much so. And if there's a moment that resonates with me enormously from his novelistic production, it's in Le 4e siècle, where he's describing the Middle Passage in a way I don't know any other author who has so successfully managed to show at once the insufficiency of the language to describe this reality, but in so doing to describe the reality, and only to say that, to push slightly against the idea of dirtying the language, to suggest that he also very much revels in French. And like Césaire, I would say, also at the same time that he is pushing against the constraints and what is the obvious existential quandary of being obliged to use the language and the tools that have been so long used to oppress those like him, is that part of his triumph is having so thoroughly integrated and assimilated those tools to make them something gorgeous and divine, in ways that belie the mire in some ways too, right? That suggests that that he has found other beauty in what could otherwise be dystopia, right? To go back to your concept of utopia. So I don't know that it's a contradiction, but certainly an expansion of his, I use the word revel, the way he revels in language that reminds us of the beauty of French in a way that doesn't necessarily have to be uncomfortable, because his language is French, obviously, right? And it's a particularly Glissantian French that need not necessarily be troubled by itself in every way.
If I may just rebondir
Voilà.
on this. No, I don't think that we are that far apart. They all revel in French. I mean, all of them, Senghor, all of them. So I'm sure that Ngugi would find that quite bizarre. Ngugi would find it bizarre because Ngugi believes in the idea that there is a pure language somewhere where one can return to which one can return to in order to draw on its inner resources and make sense of oneself in the world. So, for instance, he would go back to Kikuyu in writing his text. These people do not go back to Creole as such, although Glissant uses a little bit of it. Senghor is almost oblivious to his original language, Sérère. Now, how do we interpret? No, he doesn't. He doesn't. I mean, he refers to it, but Senghor hasn't written a treatise in Sérère. He hasn't done what what's his name is, who translated Shakespeare, like Julius Nyerere. I mean, Nyerere sat down, translated Shakespeare in. Senghor hasn't done that. And in fact, Senghor has some really scandalous statements on his love of French, which one could, anyway. But to soil, let me just
Don't
finish.
say that.
To soil a language is precisely, first of all, to recognize that its origins are always impure. That there is no language whose origins are pure. So you have to come back to that originary impurity if you want to account for that which has been soiled. The Middle Passage, the slave, all that tragic history. And you have to go back to that in a project of multiplication of the world, as Glissant himself puts it. Multiplication of the world out of what has been considered a waste, in the understanding that the beauty of the world and its meaning lies in what it is that we have put at the corner, what we have excluded. And it's not just a beatification of French. They are not at all naive when it comes to their engagement with French. And most of the times we have had a very naive reading of what appears to be naive. So I wanted to insist on that. As far as Senghor is concerned, I'm not sure that we'll agree, but I would be happy to listen to you on Senghor and French.
I don't want to divert from Glissant. I think it would be a shame. But I think it's language. I think we're a bit too emotional about language, in the sense that you have to look at what the language is doing. And I think that people like Glissant, Césaire, Senghor, they tried to get hold of a language, which was French, and do something and advance with it, and go somewhere with it, fight with it. I mean, the negritude movement has its pluses and minuses, but they did try to find a way out of colonization and use literature as a tool to fight for independence. So a language in itself is not enough. It's what you do with it. That's why even if we want to talk about Ngugi, I would say that it's part of the problem, the issue of language, African languages, indigenous languages, but it's not the solution necessarily, because you look at countries like Rwanda, where you had one common language, and it certainly didn't help. What I mean is that, again, it's what you do with the language. You can use a language in a divisive way. So we've got to work on several fronts. But I don't think, unfortunately, there's one solution there that is going to solve all our problems, including languages. But I totally agree that we need to develop our languages, and what has happened to the languages of Africa is part of the difficulties we have to get out of our situation. But that is, we would be fooling ourselves if we think that that's going to be the solution of all our problems. Just want to say something about Glissant. If there's something that I regret, is I feel a certain distanciation with Africa, which wasn't happening with Césaire. I think Césaire was looking towards Africa in a much more profound way that Glissant did. And although I know that they have extended, I say they because Chamoiseau, Confiant, they have extended the concept of creolization. For me, it's still not, should I say, big enough. I always, and he said it, I think, that he wanted the specificity of the Caribbean to be recognized. And in that process, he kind of excluded me. They please rebound.
At the risk of being, so two things. So you went from language to Africa. All right. So as far as the language is concerned, at the risk of being facile, just a little reminder, right? That maybe a worry in this conversation would be to presume that the use of language for the French-speaking Caribbean author, for the post-colonial global South author more broadly, has to necessarily be a conscious political intervention at every step, right? That in ways that might belie somewhat the poetic intention, in which the poet, every poet, is in some measure of discomfort with the capacity of language to express what's in the soul, right? So if we allow for that to be an artistic reality, unspecific to Glissant, unspecific to Césaire, unspecific to the context of the colonized, post-colonized subject, that maybe leaves us a little bit more room to give them a break on whether you're writing in Creole versus in French versus in English, which is, I work on the spiralistes, who are very little known and circulated, and there's one of the three authors who said at one point, I don't write for myself. If my book sold in the United States, I would write them in English if I could, right? So the idea that the artist also doesn't necessarily always need to do battle with this question of purity or impurity, the coincidence of the language and what the readership wants to say. But as far as Glissant in Africa, and you said it at the end, his project was quite specific. it was that. It was at once specific and global in its intention. We all know this, right? That Relevance was based on an anchoring in the specific as a way of attempting to speak to the universal. I know it's a bad word, but in the best sense of the human, let's say. The two world, the everything world and the all world. So I don't know if it's so fair to the critique of his distance from Africa, because his intention was at once so generous, looking outward, but in this real sense that he needed to understand the space immediately around him if he was going to do any good looking outward. So, yeah, I feel somehow protective of the great burden of politics married to art that's placed on the American writer in particular. I'd argue on the writer overall.
Well then, this actually leads up to it's sort of a summation. I write in the presence of all the languages of the world. That's Glissant. So, but yes. Now I wanted to kind of pursue some of this a little more, and this was the phrase that Glissant had inscribed on his tombstone. Rien n'est vrai, tout est vivant. Nothing is true, everything is living. And I wondered how you'd comment on that. This is the imprévu.
You start.
Rien n'est vrai, tout est vivant. Wow, that's. I mean, yeah, it shows my ignorance. I didn't know that it was on his tombstone. I think it's amazing because, yeah, I think it goes with the rhizomic idea, concept that things are evolving all the time, and it's true. If you're alive, you're always changing. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You have no idea. So you kind of negotiate your life as it comes, and I think it's true. I like this because it means that you have no certainty. That if I want to translate what is being said, you have absolutely no certainty. You cannot say this is for real, this is for true, this is going to happen forever and ever and after. And I think that's what he was trying to do as well in terms of identity. Is he understood that identity was a changing things, a changing, because I look at traveling. Each time I travel to a country, to a new country, my identity changes in the sense that it enriches itself. So I'm not the same person. I mean, 14 years in South Africa has had an impact on me that, and I'm not the same person than when I arrived there. So in that sense, each time we meet more people, we interact with other people, then we are changed, and our identity continues to evolve until we die. Basically, we change all the time. That's why I think I just want to say that on paper this is a very positive thing, but in reality, it's much more difficult. I think the absence of certainty makes life much more difficult because you cannot rest. You cannot think that you've arrived at a place, and it can be very difficult also in terms of identity. I know Senghor talked a lot about la civilisation de l'universel, and he was very enthusiastic about le métissage. But my view is more mixed in the sense that there is something very hard in not being in a particular place. It's not it's not always easy, because basically if you're not in one place, you are nowhere. and that can be a very difficult proposition.
I think it's an exaggeration, what Glissant is saying. Rien n'est vrai. I don't believe that. He should have said, not everything is vrai. Huh? Some things are true. Of course, they are. Some, I was born, that's true. Huh? I am here. It's a fact. It is true that I'm here. Unless, okay, I don't know myself or you don't know me and all of that. So we cannot say that rien n'est vrai. So, look, it's a figure of speech. The correct way is to say not everything is true. That's the correct way. So there's a poetic license here in a statement such as rien n'est vrai, because as an African and a black man, I cannot, the consequences, the political consequences of subscribing to the fact that rien n'est vrai are just, the price to pay for such a statement is colossal. It's just too colossal. It means, okay, nothing happened in Baltimore, nothing is going on in Ferguson. You can extend it to that. So personally, I don't buy into that. So the way I understand this is, okay, how do we pose the question of the relationship between truth and life? Another important thinker, Jesus Christ, said, resolved it by saying, I'm the way, I'm the truth, and I'm life. So all of that in one figure. Glissant is modest enough to not go the Christ way, or to suggest that, because certainly, I mean, he doesn't believe in that. But the problem he is trying to pose is that of the relationship between truth and life. Truth as, in his mind, that which might end up in sectarianism. When we read his Poetics of Relation and his critique of identities that are based on a root, as opposed to those identities that are based on movement. The identities based on root and territory end up turning into sectarianism. I'm quoting him. And identities that are based on movement open up to le grand large, the open-endedness, the politics of open-endedness. And therefore, he puts truth on the way, on the side of that which might preclude that open-endedness, that which might lead us to a certain form of closure. And on the other side, the politics of life, exactly in the way Véronique tried to explain it, as that which is constantly moving, that which sets us on the path to something he calls errantry. And I mean, I don't know, errance, yeah. So that's how I read it. But to read it like that, one has to think with and against him.
I have one. I think it's working. Well, so this is on his tombstone.
Yes,
But obviously he said this somewhere else.
yes.
Where?
I think in the Philosophie
De la relation. Ah, d'accord.
Where I'm getting most of the quotes from, because it
Okay,
was his
his
last
last
published book in French, and so I'm bringing it into English here.
So rien n'est vrai, tout est vivant. I don't know that we can have it both ways, hold him accountable to it as literal at the same time as we think of it as poetic. It is obviously a metaphor, and it is obviously au deuxième degré. It's not true that nothing is true, and I'm pretty sure he wouldn't suggest the contrary. But what I heard in it, so but But then it wouldn't be glissant, now would it? Ça serait pas du glissant s'il avait dit comme ça. Ça serait pas du glissant. But what I first heard when you said it in English, in my mind, I thought of to speak is to lie. And going back to this question of language and the disconnect and the lie that happens immediately as you encounter through language an interlocutor, or as you confront the fact that we are in common. Just that I'm saying things, and the fact that you're nodding your head means that I'm going to keep saying things because I didn't say something totally wrong yet, right? But that what I want to say is conditioned by the reaction and the response of the beings in common with whom I have to exist. So to that extent, the truth that I started with may not be the truth that comes out of my mouth, as I appreciate the environment into which I put it. And so it is alive, right? It's alive, and it's related. It's in constant dynamic conversation. And so so that's a very positive way of understanding the lie that is self-expression to me. That doesn't get to nothing can be solid or counted upon as being true, but rather that there is conditionality and contingency in everything that is posited as absolute. Maybe not that you've been born, right? Yeah, but a lot of other stuff, right, that we take as objective fact, for sure.
I will agree that you are born and you're going to die. Those are the two certainties.
And be black.
Huh?
And
And
be
in
black.
between, and what? What did you say?
And be black.
And be black.
And be black.
And be black. Okay. All right. But the problem is the in between those two certainties. And I think that what's been said is about time. It talks about time. That means that the moment you are born, you start losing it. You start. It's not a problem. That's what we all go through. But you start degenerating.
Some of us faster than others.
Yes, faster than others. But that's what happens. The moment you are born. And I think it's that way you can't hold on to anything. And I think it's about life, it's about time, more than anything else, I think. That's how I understand it, yeah.
I mean, it is the truth that he died, right? So, obviously he's making a statement of something, beyond that. And just as another thing, just because I would like to open it up to questions, so I'm just going to put in one more quote, which is, relevant to what's going on in, what was once called Mare Nostrum, the Mediterranean, and this is from a very prophetic text that he and Patrick Chamoiseau collaborated on, which was, outlawing national identity, can the walls fall? And this was done at the time that Sarkozy proposed Minister of, national identity, and so they wrote this pamphlet, and what Glissant says, and I'm sure, we'll admit Chamoiseau's presence in here too, through the word immigration, something like a life-giving breath passes.
Wow, yes.
Through the word immigration, something like a life-giving breath passes.
Yeah, what was it in French?
I don't have it in French. It's my translation. I used it.
Wow.
It's a souffle, right?
No.
Passes. Is it, what was passes? Was it
Passes.
passé?
Yes, passes.
It was passé?
Yes.
You mean it's a positive view on immigration?
Yes.
Yeah.
But the idea of
Let's see.
immigrating, right?
Can you repeat?
I need it.
Through the word immigration, something like a life-giving breath passes.
Tu vois, c'est pas forcément mourir, ça, c'est peut-être
Non.
traverser aussi. Hein.
No.
Bah, on peut rien faire sans origine.
Si. No. It's a very, very positive and optimistic view of immigration, which unfortunately is not what is happening today.
Yes.
And that is the huh?
Everyone's trying to translate. Ah, it's positive. Okay.
Yeah, it's a positive. It's the idea that immigration brings a new breath of air. But unfortunately, we see that today this is not happening at all. In many countries, lots of countries in Europe as well as in Africa, we have, people seem to be closing in on themselves. I can take South Africa with what has happened recently with the attacks, the wave of xenophobia, which shows that the whole issue of immigration is also a problem in Africa. It is a problem in Europe. It is a problem in the US. So it's not happening the way I think somebody like Glissant wanted it to happen, and I think if he's probably he probably toward the end of his life was disappointed by the turn of events, and he looked at the internet as the symbol of that globalization gone wrong. And the promises of it not materializing. Yeah.
I would want to see the original.
You don't trust
No, I trust it, but I don't feel comfortable enough to it's a very powerful sentence. It's extremely powerful, and it raises all sorts of questions. The first one being, if not a repudiation, at least a putting into question in a very radical way of a specific term, immigration, that is referring to a whole set of processes and movements which are then congealed in a bureaucratic and institutional apparatus, the Ministère de l'Immigration, which paradoxically is itself conjugated with the term identity. That you have a ministry of identity. And national identity, for that matter. And we know very well what the Ministry of National Identity, its purpose, and its function in the history of France, especially under Pétain. So the Ministry of National Identity in the history of France, conjugated with immigration, is not life-giving. It's anything but life-giving. If it's anything, it's about, the other week, the 700 people who are drowned in the Mediterranean. The 3,782 people who have died trying to cross Europe. It's about the wars all over the world, as Véronique was suggesting, that we keep building. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have built more walls than we have ever had before. It's a set of other different kinds of walls, old and new ones, translated into mass incarceration, as is the case in the United States of America. It's the state basically redistributing death in a way that is, on the one hand, extrajudicial, as we see in most parts of the planet right now, and in a way in which is so contrary to, at least if we believe Western political philosophy, to what the whole purpose of the state was in the first instance, meaning securing protection to its citizens. So what happens when the state, which is supposed to give protection to its citizens, becomes precisely the institution that kills them, extrajudicially? It seems to me, that's why I'm asking for the original. It's a very heavy sentence, And it opens up into what are the impasses of the times we live in, which are times of not only global apartheid, in which people don't want to live any longer with those who are different from them. They want to live among themselves. We see it in South Africa with gated communities, with all these new forms of the urban, which are about separation and which reproduce segregation, even in those spaces where the formal law that instituted it has gone. So it seems to me that, Glissant here again helps us to at least start asking really difficult questions about the times we live in, and what are the cracks that we witness, and what is it that they mean in relation to a very serious history of encounters he himself defined basically as both full of promises, but also as tragic.
I'm realizing it maybe is not as important what the original French was as what the whole context was. I'm very curious to understand in what that was embedded, what was the sentence before and the sentence afterward, simply because immigration is a life-giving breath for someone, or in the history of France, immigration has been a life-giving breath to France, right? And one might say the same thing, obviously, about the melting pot that is our great country, right? That life, so it's not necessarily life-giving breath for the migrant, but it certainly is doing someone some good until that someone decides we've had enough, and then up go the gates and up go the frontiers. And I would just add to that, use the word xenophobia, which is something we've talked a lot about in my class, and I think a lot about not so much as fear of the migrant or fear of the other, but as fear of the sameness of the other, meaning fear of the very little bit of difference that actually separates our condition from that of those who are right now, the hordes at the gate. And that if we're trying to establish that difference, it's because what we're seeing looks very human and possible as our collective fate. And I think that in a context where, since 2008, we have global financial crises, where we have the phenomenon of environmental devastation that affects us all, not just people in Nepal or in Japan or in Chile or in Haiti. But when we start to realize that these things that we have thus far relegated to the spaces that we don't want to go, but that people want to come from and be with us, we're also seeing how we're not that different from those people, and that their reality very much translates, as I said, our common destiny. So xenophobia seems to me it's trying to put outside a fear that is internal, which makes sense that there are more and more physical barriers to in some way compensate for what is not a barrier, in fact, which is a common humanity that is following a very collective path towards a not so bright future.
I think we can, I'll give Glissant the last word here because I want to open it up for questions. I can change in order to exchange with the other without, however, losing or distorting myself. Sans me dénaturer. So, is there a mic, or should I distribute the mic out here? Who would like to ask some questions? If you speak loud, we can hear you, I think. Yes.
Yeah, hi. Speaking, I just have a comment. I really don't have a picture. I am from the Graduate Center, and I had a few seminars with Glissant. And one of the discussions that we had in one seminar was about Toulon. And it just brings us back to this notion about language, because I happen to be from Haiti, and I said, but you are playing in Toulon, you are playing with the nation Creole terms, tout le monde. by tout le monde, it means each person, as it means in Creole, but it also means the whole world. So, and which brings us also that when he talks about that he speaks in the presence of every language, he didn't write a thesis in Creole, but Creole is included in the French.
Yes.
And the other thing is about, and it also brings us to his relationship to French, because Glissant is Martinican, but Glissant is a Frenchman. He used to always say, there is nobody who knows, in French of course, but nobody knows the history of France as well as I do. You cannot even find a Frenchman who knows the history of French as well as I do. No, but and when he says rien n'est vrai, tout est vivant, one of the things, immediately what comes to my mind, even though I never heard of that, of course, he's a great literary theorist, and Balzac, at the beginning of the community men, Balzac says in English, or in French, all is true. So here we have, and of course, as we described, the presence of Balzac, the presence of Glissant. Balzac was also a very powerful, anchored man. And of course, sorry, but he was white, okay, I mean that. So there is immediately here a contradiction, is an opposition, because all he's saying, rien n'est vrai, he's opposing himself to Balzac, who is la pensée continentale, and he is la pensée archipélique. And then, tout est vivant, of course, the reason that nothing is true is because everything is alive, as you already all said, everything is constantly changing. And what I feel, if we're in a seminar with Glissant, what they would say, I don't deny that there is injustice in Ferguson and there is injustice all over each of these places in America, but each point of view is true. So nothing is actually real. Even the policeman's point of view, even if Glissant doesn't agree with it, he will consider it and accept it. Every voice must be heard in Glissant. So this is, and also, you didn't mention, give a whole list of Caribbean and
Yes.
and African. You didn't mention anybody from Haiti. No, but
Would anybody
one
like
of the
to
best
answer
poems
this?
ever, Glissant loved Haiti, and one of the best poems ever written about Haiti is by Glissant about how Haiti is a matrix of the Caribbean, as you know. So that's, I don't have any question. I didn't have comments, and I just find all the probably are what we say even though it didn't happen, and we're not in the seminar, so that's excellent.
Would anybody like to answer? Another question?
We could quarrel on the exegesis of the term, but that's what he did. But Haiti, of course, I mean, Haiti, it's so evident. Sorry, we didn't mention.
No, it's okay.
It's not okay. It was just
Le lieu est incontournable. Question?
Yes, I'm thinking about the relationship between poetry and philosophy, and the relationship between the everyday, the quotidian, and the dream, which has this essential impulse of being, right? And so this idea that nothing is true makes me go back to James Baldwin, who says we don't know anything at all. And all he means by that is, going back to what Véronique says, is that if it's a moral proposition, right? About how you move in the world. That, and it's a certain kind of humility about the kind of immenseness of human living, the activity of it. And so it's not, so we have to walk on both feet here if we speak simultaneously, just like the quote on Tombstone. But there's something about the impulse to migrate, voluntary or otherwise, that has always already contained within it a life-giving breath. There's a wish, right? Either to survive and to die, like what's going on in the Mediterranean now, or whatever it is, the impulse to pick up and go somewhere is a massive proposition. And I think if we both hold like like you said, concrete abstractions, right? Both hold the concrete reality that's on the ground in our mind, but also, aim towards a kind of beauty and grandeur that comes from a philosophy that's suggesting something about how you comport yourself in human interaction. So I think, I totally agree with what you're saying, but I think no one disagreeing here. When Baldwin says, we don't know anything at all, it's just saying, like, settle down. And it's an open-endedness, it's about contingency, but it's about the stuff of life. And it's being kind of, stunned into a kind of humble silence before the very fact of it. So I think we both things exist on that.
I mean, this is rather an aside, but because I work so frequently with Senghor and Glissant in the context of North Africa, I kind of want to hear the rest of the argument about Senghor. The very end for that, but I'm curious.
Just to start a fight.
Talk about Glissant's friendship with Yassi.
Provoke
I love Senghor's poetry. I love it. He's probably one of the most important poets of the 20th century, at least in French. But I really think somewhere that Senghor's problem is that he didn't obtain for Senegal what Césaire got for Martinique. And this no, I'm absolutely serious. And the failure to obtain for Senegal the same status Martinique obtained within the French Republic explains a lot of his subsequent work. And a lot of the differences one sees, at least in Francophone, so-called Francophone Africa, between intellectual histories of Senegal and intellectual histories of Cameroon, for instance. The fact that in Cameroon, Cameroon in philosophy, literature, arts, the relationship with France is at the opposite of what Senegalese elites have entertained and keep reproducing today. So that's quite a provocative statement, and I would be very happy to hear what Véronique has to say about it, but for the time being, she seems seriously disturbed.
Yeah, can you specify what Césaire got for yeah?
Césaire got the départementalisation. He got the départementalisation. And Senghor, according to historians, he got an independence he didn't want to get. He didn't want it. When you read his political writings, he was dreaming of a communauté Afro-Française. That's what he wanted. He didn't want to sever his relationship with France, but he was asked to take independence. So I think that from a political history point of view, for anyone who wants to do the intellectual genealogies of so-called Francophone Africa, this is a very important historical point.
No, yes, we're diverting a little bit from the subject, but I think that one of my kind of regret about Césaire is that he wasn't able to lead Martinique to independence, and that the movement died. And apparently, I read somewhere that the internet and all globalization project was also a cause of the failure of the independentist movement to succeed, because distance was abolished by the internet, and then it wasn't a problem anymore, the fact that France was so far away. But I must say, when you read him, when you read his work, and then what did not happen in Martinique, in Guadeloupe, and all that, for me it's a big disappointment. Okay, you're saying that Senghor didn't want the independence. Houphouët-Boigny didn't want independence either, but they took it. Yeah. They took it, and it was a whole movement, and a lot of African countries became independent. So I mean, I'm not trying to do a comparative thing here, but it's just that sometimes I get a bit worried about the negritude movement, because I don't want us to kill our predecessors. I mean, they did what they could in their time. They succeeded in certain things and failed in others. A bit like Glissant, as a matter of fact. But if you kill your fathers, then you're left dangling in the air, and you can't just take it from there.
I would second that, and simply say that I think it's a dangerous game to play at comparative independences, right? Because to go back to Haiti, right, that's always the way the Haitian independence is categorized as either a great success or a great failure. In those kinds of value judgments placed on what is very historically contextualized, you run the risk of taking out the reality that was contemporary, right? And in entering into a hierarchizing blame game or valuing of, as you said, different colonial experiences and experiences of post-coloniality that the word independence is perhaps insufficient to contain. So, yeah.
Just very quickly, Glissant himself wrote some very beautiful things about Césaire, so there have been people who always try to put them in like opposition and not in relation, and in fact, Glissant's obituary for Césaire is, a really, really beautiful piece of work. So again, I don't think that this desire to kill the fathers is necessarily there. I think it's produced by people who want to see the battle royale, as Brent Edwards said the other night about Brathwaite and Walcott, where there can only be one, and they need to duke it out, and this one has to be better than the other, so choose your sides. And, I think that's futile, actually.
No, look, we have to take history into consideration. And I'm talking about historical facts as evidence in most of the recent work. I mean, the last one is Fred Cooper, working on the basis of the archives, things everybody can check. It's not a matter of killing the father. It's a matter of kind of reading we can make of history as it happened. And of course, there were many scenarios. That's what Cooper shows indeed, that there were many different options. The question is, why is it that one option was taken and the other not taken? These are historical questions, and they can be explained historically. No need to kill anybody, even less so the father. Although the desire to kill fathers, as we know, has always been with us. So let's come back to history, yeah.
Well, you know what Glissant thought about history, though, so there too we have to watch out for the booby traps, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, there are so many of them. History is about
exactly,
navigating many, many different booby traps and paying a price for each of those moves. So the drama is that those who navigate the booby traps, usually they are not the ones to pay the price. They outsource the price to some others.
Yes.
Just one comment. I think we're forgetting that with this project, the assimilation project, it was voted in by the left, and they're the very ones now who are
Glissant wrote very well about Léris's Contact de civilisation too, and poetic intention and l'intention poétique. So, and I think Léris was very important to him.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about l'indépendance.
We're almost out of time, so
Okay,
please
the
keep it.
independence of Martinique. Césaire said, and I saw the video. He says what he did was looked at Haiti as a model, and when he looked at the risks of Martinique and Guadeloupe becoming like Haiti, meaning like a minority of capitalists enslaved 99% of the rest, he said no, the risks are too much, so we are going to be French and everybody will have civil rights. In short, but it's on YouTube and everybody can see what he has.
That's very in short, though, huh? That's
You're going to blame me for telling you.
Very short. But I had the privilege to visit Martinique and Guadeloupe and Haiti, as a matter of fact. I'm not sure, as they say in South Africa, it's 100%. I think there are a lot of problems. Many problems. So it was a question of historical choice, but the choice that was taken also might be also controversial in terms of the relationship with France, in terms of the economic problems on the islands, in terms of the a certain level of alienation,
The environmental
in terms
realities.
of the environmental reality, the exploitation of the resources. So here again, we can't say that. Yeah. So everything is kind of relative.
I think we're just about out of time here. So I want to really thank our panelists very much for the.